Kia ora everyone, this is your introduction video into how to write your critical text report. In this particular video, I will be focusing on the hypothesis task, and so there is a different one for the lens task. Just make sure that you watch the right one. If the hypothesis task is the one for you, then you're in the right place, and so I want to just give you a heads up that the video will be reasonably dense. There will be lots of information on the screen, and so I encourage you to pause the video and have a read through the slides, because I can't read out all of them, all of the words on the screen. And so I've got some example introductions for you, an example body paragraph and a conclusion, and those are color coded, so it should give you a good idea about of what you need to include. But again, I just want to reinforce that please do pause those, take your time going through them, make sure that you've got everything, and once you're done, go back to the success checklist so that you can make sure that you actually have everything you need to complete this internal successfully. Right then, so let's have a look at that first. If we are looking at the hypothesis task, then in your introduction, you need to really clearly state your hypothesis. Remember, a hypothesis is not a question, it's a statement. It can be expressing, or it should be expressing, an opinion about the particular text that you have studied. And so you are making clear in your introduction what your hypothesis is, who the author is of the text, like the author or director, and also obviously the title of the text. You might also already want to introduce the critical opinions that you will explore and the ideas that those critics offer. They do not have to have the same opinion. They can, but they don't have to. And it might offer a great opportunity for you if they are not exactly the same. Right, so in your body paragraphs, each body paragraph should focus on a single critic, and so you should probably have at least 2 body paragraphs so that you can talk about 2 different critics. You need to make it really clear what the critic's attitude towards the hypothesis is, so do they tend to agree or support your hypothesis or not? You will need to use at least one quote from the critic's text. And so you might be quoting your actual text, the one that you've read. So say, like, if you were studying Arrival, you might want to include a quote from Arrival, but you also need a quote from the critical text, and that's really important. We need to see that evidence. You will then need to explain and discuss what the quote actually means, and you need to make some specific connections to the book or the film or the poem, whichever one you've studied in this critical text internal. You then need to discuss a little bit how reliable and trustworthy those sources are. This bit can also be done in the log of your sources, and so at some point you will have to have done it, but if it doesn't make it into the report, as long as you've got it in your log, that will be fine. You will add sort of a layer of complexity if you put it in your report, and so you might as well. You also need to discuss the impact of the critical opinion on your attitude towards the hypothesis. So does the critic influence you? Have they influenced your thinking? Have you changed your mind in some sort of way? Have they pushed you in a different direction? And once you've done that, you get to the conclusion. And so you briefly summarize the critical opinion that was discussed, or the critic's opinions that you have discussed in your essay. And then you will just need to discuss whether you think your original hypothesis was actually backed up well by the critics or not, whether you would change it slightly now that you have read and analyzed those critics, and so on. Right, so let's look at an introduction. If you want to, just in terms of structuring, you can put your hypothesis at the top of the page like a title. That would be fine. It should come up in the introduction, though. You should weave it in somewhere. So make sure that you state the text and the author. And so in this case, the person has studied William Shakespeare's classic story or play of Othello. And they are clearly stating their hypothesis, saying that Iago sabotaged Othello's relationship with Desdemona because he was jealous of him, right? That's their statement. They think that is true. They claim it in the introduction as if it was true. And so that is what a hypothesis should be doing. It's not a question. Again, it's a statement. And so they're introducing that there's several different critics, and in yellow here you can see that they have focused on three main critics. The three main critics and time periods I studied were in their list, the times and the names. They also explain that they will show different views on Iago's motives and Othello's and Desdemona's relationship. And so I'm now expecting that in their paragraphs, they will present different views. If they now go on and present exactly the same views, then I'll be questioning what they've been saying in the introduction. So make sure that whatever you claim in your introduction, you then back up with what follows in the body paragraph. Now, let's have a look at a body paragraph. This is reasonably dense, and again, the reminder, pause the video to have a good look at what's in these sections. So, in a body paragraph, you will need to focus on a single critic or a single critical opinion. So the student here has introduced the critic, Sam Wood, and then they've offered a brief summary of that critic's attitude towards the hypothesis that the student has developed. So Sam Wood stated that the relationship between Othello and Desdemona may have been tainted from the very beginning because of the difference in their race and social stature when they married. Okay, so brief summary of what they're saying. Then in blue you will find the quotations from the critical text. Now in this example, you just need to look really closely because this is actually Sam Wood saying something about Othello, and then within the quote he quotes from the play itself. And so the student here has got evidence from their critic with evidence from the text integrated. That might not be the case for you, and so you might need to have a quote from your critic as well as a quote from your actual text. And they've done that several times, so you can see there's bits of blue everywhere here. And so again down here we've got Woods says that Iago revels in his ability to manipulate his victims, and goes on to explain this in more detail. Again, take the time to pause and have a look at that slide. In yellow, there's an explanation and discussion of what that quotation actually means. So you can't just dump the quote there and then hope for the best and hope that the marker is going to read it and see what you have seen. You need to tell the marker, the reader of your essay, the reader of your critical text analysis, what you make of this quote. And so a good idea is to start with this shows. And so this shows is just a small example of the sort of abuse and discrimination that Othello and Desdemona faced when choosing to defy the unwritten laws of society at the time and wed. And so then the person or the student brings in their own opinion here. I believe that the strain from racial differences in this marriage could absolutely have been affected. It's heinous undoing in the 16th century and so on. So they bring in their own opinion, which is fine. You can do that. In purple, we've got some specific connections to the book. And so in here, the student has given some specific examples that relate to the book, and they've also placed them. They've said in which act and scene they can be found. And then they've added some discussion of the reliability and the trustworthiness of this critical opinion. And so they are saying the argument Wood poses as to why Iago would want to break up the marriage between Othello and Desdemona was that he was mainly motiveless villain and had no discernible reason for his actions. This is a viewpoint not only held by Wood in the year 2009, but by many notable critics throughout history. And so he's the student is giving this critic a little bit more credibility by saying they are not the only ones thinking this, and so this is quite a common assumption, and I've read more. They're essentially saying I've read more than what I can present here, which is always a good, helpful thing to do for your overall for the overall perception of your work. Right, discussing the impact of the critical opinion on your attitude or your thinking towards your own hypothesis. And again, this is at the end of the paragraph, so the student here has discussed how they have been influenced by the critic that they've read, and so they're going in with the phrase, personally, although I agreed with this initial statement regarding the role of races in the play Othello, I find it hard to agree with Wood, and then they go on and explain why they can't agree. And they've actually done a really good job discussing and unpacking where the difficulty here was for them. And so that's really powerful if you can say, yeah, okay, I can see where that critic is coming from, but I disagree. Or initially I thought it was this way, but then the critic convinced me, or reading this critic's opinion convinced me that actually they had a point too. And so this is what engaging with critical text is about, that you reflect on your own thinking, you see and look at the research that other people have done and take advantage of it, shape your own thoughts. Now, here are some sentence starters for you. So, just like the paragraph structure was listed on the previous slide, I've just added some sentence starters for each one of the different color-coded sections. And so this should give you a really good starting point to get an idea of where you might want to go with this. If you're not quite sure how to integrate bits and pieces like your quotations and how to unpack, this is a good place to go. And again, pause the video to have a closer look. In your conclusion, you will need to briefly summarize the critical opinions discussed. And so you can see here that the student has listed the different critics they've discussed. Obviously, we've only looked at the Sam Wood paragraph, but there would have been other paragraphs on those writers as well. And then they briefly summarize their observations and the critics' observations over time. And then in the final step, they are referring back to their original hypothesis and deciding whether that hypothesis was true or partially true and why. And so they're saying, Bradley's article aligned the best with my hypothesis. So from that, I can conclude that I made a logical, plausible statement, and that the reasoning behind Iago sabotaging Othello's relationship with Desdemona could very well have been because he was jealous of Othello. And so they finish their critical text assessment on restating their hypothesis, saying this has basically been confirmed by one of my critics, which is a really useful thing to do. So you start off with your hypothesis, and then at the very end you come back to it and you decide, is your hypothesis still true, or have you got to slightly change it, which is also fine, like as long as you put that reflection in. So once again, look back, replay the video, replay the parts, look at the big body paragraph, have a good read of it. And once you are finished and you're done with your conclusion, make sure that you go back to the third slide of this video and you look at the success checklist, just to make sure that you've got everything. With all of this information, you should be well set up to write a good report. Remember that you can always get in touch with your teachers. Feel free to message me or get in touch with your own teachers, and then we can always help you. All right. Take care and have a good day. Bye.